Michael Penix Jr., the draft pick that shocked all of us fans, analysts, and even the NFL teams. The selection that was not supposed to be, and a move that everyone seems to hate because the Falcons have a franchise QB already, and one that cost them a hefty price tag. With that, man, the Falcons had a rare opportunity to pick another deadly weapon of Rome Odunze or a real difference maker at edge or corner. The Falcons had a golden opportunity and decided to go against the grain, to zig and not zag with their high draft pick. Why did the Falcons do what they did? Let's find out. Remember this clip from the draft? What seemingly was Arthur Blank, the owner of the Atlanta Falcons, demanding an answer as to why the GM decided to draft a QB with their pick is completely the wrong narrative. Arthur Blank was on board with this long before the draft even took place. But why would he be? He just dropped $180 million on a top 12 quarterback. They have some great pieces on offense, and with a splash move at defense, they are contenders. While a Super Bowl is the ultimate goal for Arthur Blank, he just had to endure, in his eyes, 2 way too long years of miserable quarterback play. See, for Arthur, since owning the Falcons, he has had elite caliber quarterbacks to keep the team relevant with Michael Vick and Matt Ryan. And it wasn't until Matt Ryan demanded to leave town that they no longer had that elite viable QB play, which if you didn't already know, Ryan wanted to leave after the team tried to send a haul for Deshaun Watson. This left the Falcons in an unusual place with no QB in sight and no true succession plan, which then led to the Falcons finding themselves with Marcus Mariota and a 3rd round QB that everyone knew wasn't the guy. And so for the 2022 and 2023 season, the quarterback play was atrocious. This is with having a pretty good offensive line and some high top-level talented playmakers. And so this explains the massive move for Kirk Cousins. Arthur Blank and the GM went straight for the top QB in the market, even going as far as tampering to ensure their success, following up with guaranteeing the future at QB with Michael Penix Jr. Arthur Blank got his reassurance that there will be no QB issues in the near future. Case closed. But this doesn't explain the decision to draft Penix where he was drafted. The Falcons easily could have gotten that blue chip player with their pick and taken a developmental swing at QB in the later rounds like with Spencer Rattler or even Jordan Travis. While that is a fine process to go about in the draft, the Falcons were ahead of the game with their move, seeing into the future of the possible pitfalls they could have made and probably would have made. Honestly, the move to pick Penix was a galaxy brain move on the Falcons' part. See, let's think for a minute. We know who Kirk Cousins is. He is a really good quarterback. And lately, with a little Jay Jetta's help, he is playing the best ball of his career. Given the playmakers the Falcons have, and Drake London, who is a elite wide receiver 1 potential, Kyle Pitts, one of the greatest tight end prospects to ever come out, Darnell Mooney, who is a upside wide receiver 2 with elite speed, and Rondale Moore as a slot guy. But wait, there's Bijan Robinson as well, one of the greatest running back prospects since Adrian Peterson. And for funsies, Tyler Algier, who is just simply a great running back. That is a ridiculous amount of offensive talent, and honestly, we could be talking about the best in the NFL given age. Not to mention, the Falcons have a sneakily good O-line. It's nothing fancy, but they mow down people in the run game at least. So Kirk Cousins is going to be cooking with this offense, especially being placed in a similar scheme to what the Vikings run with Kevin O'Connell. Zach Robinson, the offensive coordinator for the Falcons, runs practically the same thing with variations, of course, of that McVay tree. His Falcons team is going to be winning a lot of games with an offense that could be lighting up scoreboards. In a way, they saw him do with Matty Ice in the MVP run. All that to say, their draft pick is not going to be very high, and really for as long as Kirk Cousins is on the team. When you're a deep playoff contender like the Falcons are going to be, you're just not going to be in the spot that they were in this past 2024 draft. That is, unless you send an absolute haul of draft picks to get up and draft a guy, which 1 is never a guarantee, and 2, at that point when Cousins' time is over in Atlanta, the team is going to have to figure out who they're going to pay and who they're trading or even letting walk. So to take all those draft picks to get a QB later on is not going to be worth it when Cousins' contract would be done down the road. It costs them a 1st round pick now, which frees up all those picks down the line to replenish the roster. And they got a pretty good prospect with their pick. You may question though, a pretty good prospect doesn't equate to 7th overall pick, given where he was on the consensus board. But the Falcons don't think Penix is just a pretty good prospect. The Falcons think Penix is one of the best QBs in the draft. We know for ourselves that among our friend group, or perhaps fantasy football group, that we all have various and sometimes polarizing takes on how good a player, team, or individual is. Like my polarizing take that Josh Allen is going to be a flop in fantasy this year. It's obviously no different for NFL teams with putting together their own draft boards. Each team is doing its own scouting and film sessions on so many players with draft time coming around. The scouts, coaches, and front office group all come from different backgrounds as well, having different successes. One GM may have a bias because he drafted a player with specific attributes that may not normally work well in the NFL, but for that player, it was a grand slam. And so he's going to pick the same. But Falcons, they had to have Michael Penix Jr. as a QB2 in the draft. Penix was their guy. And since he was their guy, of course, they're not going to care if it's that high of a pick. Him being QB2 is not as crazy as it sounds. Because in the college football playoffs versus Texas, Penix answered all the questions that people had about his game. Similarly, CJ Stroud did the same against Georgia in the college football playoffs, challenging all the so-called weaknesses to his game by showing otherwise against an insanely good defense. Texas doesn't have the Georgia defense, but they were elite defense this past year. The caveat is that Penix crushed the Texas defense and continued into the playoffs to face Michigan and lose, while Stroud lost against Georgia despite playing at a ridiculous level. But if we change the narrative that Washington lost against Texas but Penix still played out of his mind, we would have been talking about Penix as the second QB off the board, or at the very least in the conversation with Daniels and May. The Falcons must have looked at that Texas game and really liked what they saw. It was enough to convince them that Penix's weaknesses are not what they were made out to be originally, and really that he is a top caliber QB prospect. Don't forget too, the Falcons were not the only ones eyeing Penix. The Raiders, Saints, and Seahawks were all teams trying to trade into the top 10 to get Penix. So the idea of waiting until the second round to get Penix was not going to happen. They had to do it there. And honestly, I would have done the same thing. For the Falcons, their evaluation of Penix was obviously much higher than the general consensus. The Texas game convinced them of his real potential, and they were in a perfect spot to draft Penix above the teams that really wanted him. The Falcons didn't have to lose picks to make that happen. And again, when a player is your guy, when you truly believe in him, it's not going to matter what it takes to get him. And it took their own high first round pick to get their guy for the future. But there's something else that's not being discussed enough when discussing why the Falcons drafted Penix despite having Kirk Cousins. It wasn't too long ago that the end of a career for a QB was in his late 30s. And it wasn't until Tom Brady absolutely shattered that reliable measure of when a QB is quote unquote done that teams started to rethink that. But even though Brady was playing until he was 45 years old, most quarterbacks start to fall off around that 36 to 39 years old range, with Phillip Rivers, Matt Ryan, Ben Roethlisberger, Romo, Breeze, Peyton, and Eli Manning all retiring in that span or at least falling off. There is the possibility that Cousins will do the same because on average a QB falls off in that time span. And Kirk Cousins is about to turn 36 years old in August. It's not to say he's falling off right now, but it certainly is a possibility. That being said, the Falcons had to take into account his age. They can't just rely on him being physically there for the next 4 years. The other concern the Falcons have is his Achilles injury, which I know he is a pocket passer, but you hear all the time about footwork with QBs. Not to mention, Kirk Cousins' weakness is mobility outside the pocket. The Achilles tear is not going to help that. And when looking at research in regards to the loss of performance for players after Achilles tear, it was found that for QBs, the injury didn't similarly affect them as it does for running backs and linebackers. Instead, what it did do was limit their mobility. And interesting enough, it forced some QBs to change the way they throw the football. At least it did for Dan Marino, but he was 32 when that happened. Cousins was 35 years old. We know the older you get, no matter how well you recover and train, it takes longer to recover, and with each injury, your physical performance is affected. There also was a statistical difference between the amount of yards they threw for and the amount of touchdowns they had, but I disregard this information as raw stats like that vary significantly and they have a lot of uncontrollable factors at play. All being said, to think Kirk Cousins is going to take the Falcons to the promised land without any true plan for a successor based on his age and recent injury is terrible decision making. We have seen already what happens when you go full send on a QB and the train completely derails because it was all or nothing. Drafting Penix is the Falcons' safeguard. In the case for whatever reason Cousins isn't the same QB after his injury, or he falls off a cliff in terms of performance in relation to his age. Yes, he was a high draft pick, but think of it as getting a high quality product that you know will last, instead of the cheaper alternative, which you know deep down is not going to cut it for what you need it to be. Plus, the Falcons did that already with Desmond Ridder. The last reason it makes sense for the Falcons to draft Penix is something people are some way getting completely wrong. It actually doesn't just include the situation with the Falcons, but every single NFL player. See, when a player signs a deal with a team, the numbers are released out, and we see a guy signed for $120 million, 4-year deal, and $35 million guaranteed. The assumption is that he will be there for the next 4 years and get paid that exact amount. But actually, once he is paid his guaranteed money, he can basically be cut at no cost to the team. The Falcons signed Kirk Cousins to a 4-year, $180 million deal with $100 million guaranteed. So the idea that the Falcons will have Kirk Cousins for the next 4 years until 2028 and he's 40 years old is wrong. It could be if they want Cousins for that long and he wants to stay there, but the Falcons have the option to cut Cousins without being hurt by it financially after year 2 of the deal. So the Falcons have Cousins for 2 seasons. After that, they can cut him or he could leave in theory. 2 seasons is not a very long time. We know how Arthur Blank feels about having an elite QB. He did not want to have to possibly go through another period of bad QB play. He wants that safety net, the security of knowing once Cousins is done, they have not only a guy, but their guy at QB that they want. Another thing to consider too, we saw what happened with Russell Wilson and Deshaun Watson. The Falcons don't want to be that. They want to avoid that if at all possible. Another thing to be brief is people will say that he's way too old by the time he starts. And yeah, he will be 26, 27 by the time he starts most likely. But that's 10 years of QB play. If Penix is truly that guy, the Falcons will have a decade of elite play out of him. And to have a elite guy to begin with is hard enough. I don't think they'll complain about having 10 years instead of 13, 14 years. Besides, having Penix sit is great for development purposes. Yes, he did play college football for some time, but there is a lot more to his story for why that happened. Besides, the NFL is a completely different game. Any QB usually can't go from college to NFL as a quote-unquote complete quarterback. To train under a mind like Kirk Cousins would be very beneficial for him. It's part of a formula that a team that has been using to develop elite QBs for decades now. The Green Bay Packers keep finding elite QBs, but this isn't by accident. Check out the video here.